introductions, but what I would like to do is hear from, we have a couple, I know we're gonna have a couple of council members on this call. We have Councilman Cashman right now. We're gonna have Councilwoman Black in a minute, I believe. And so maybe you could just say a quick hello, Councilman Cashman, you're sort of an honorary guest at this meeting. And then I think we'll dive into what we're doing, the agenda and purpose of tonight's meeting, and then we'll go from there. So please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Paul Cashman. I represent South Denver District 6 on City Council, District 6 being basically from Downing to Quebec, from maybe up around Leetsdale down to Yale, Dartmouth, Evans, depending on where you are, east to west. Nice to be here. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And do you want to say a word about why you wanted to be here tonight, or why we have you tonight? Yeah.
I think I've expressed some concerns about some issues. Mainly, want to be sure we have adequate setbacks in suburban areas. I don't like, I think we should have two options whereby ADUs, one option would be ADUs can be used for short-term rentals. The other would be ADUs cannot be used for short-term rentals. I also have concerns about what I've heard is a desire by some to remove the owner occupancy requirement if you're going to have an ADU. Besides that, I've been a fan of ADUs since before the city was.
Right. I was hoping it's like you bring the whole package. Support for the concept and also some real interest in specific. Yeah. So thank you. And some of that we may get to tonight and some of it we may not get to tonight. But we'll see how far we get. And welcome Chelsea and Tara and Emily and others who've just joined. So what we're going to do is instead of going through introductions of everyone, we wanted to dive in so we can get to everything this meeting. But if you all would just do the thing where you rename yourself on Zoom, like many of you have already done, where you indicate the organization or neighborhood you represent, that would be super helpful for others viewing. Thank you. And so just a little reminder about what we're doing here tonight, and then we'll get started. Just basically, so this is meeting 7 of 8 at this point. And so we're getting towards the end of this process. Tonight is when we basically take the proposed alternatives that were discussed in September. And since that time, there have been 2 different focus group meetings. And I know that city staff has looked at some of the questions and input that came up at the September advisory group meeting. And you all will have a chance to look at and review and discuss and provide input on some refined strategies, refined ideas based on the input that the city staff has heard. So that's really the goal, is to present it to you, get your thoughts and questions. And that, I think with that, I'm going to turn pretty quickly here to the city staff. I did want to remind everyone that there is going to be a 5-minute public comment at the end. So if there are folks who are in the public audience, please just feel free to raise your hand toward the end. And you're also welcome to enter questions throughout the meeting, and in real time, city staff will respond to you. And we can plug those questions into the rest of the meeting as well. So yes, please.
If I can interrupt for just a second. I believe Councilman Flynn just texted me, said he's in the meeting as well, but I don't see him. Is he not in as a panelist?
I think Councilman Flynn is in the public sort of participation room, and we can move him to the panelist room if he would like to be moved.
Yeah, I believe he would.
Okay. And so what we're going to do is we'll do that here in a second. We'll move him from audience to the panelists. Councilwoman Black, welcome. I see you just joined. We were just doing quick intros of the elected officials who are here, and then I was explaining the purpose of tonight's meeting, and we're going to get into it. But do you want to say a quick hello first?
Well, hello, everyone. I rushed down to the city and county building and not able to access this meeting on any of my devices. So I'm on my phone now, but I'm trying to log in on my iPad, so I might log off and then log back in. But thank you for having me. I'm going to leave a little bit early, but I should be here for most of the meeting. Thanks.
That sounds great. And I think we're hoping to have you for the part where we specifically talk about the revised suburban strategy. So we'll try to cover that early. Okay, well, if there are any other questions about sort of the broad purpose, what we're doing, Councilman Flynn, do you want to say a quick hello before we launch into the meeting? I see you and I think you're off mute. Now you're on mute. Let's see, if you can tap the audio again, then we can hear you. But in the meantime, we can also proceed. Okay. Not sure what just happened. I'm sure we'll get him back. Okay. So Abe, am I passing it to you to sort of give a bit of context of what happened at the last meeting, what's happened since then? Okay, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. And Councilman Flynn, if you come off mute, I'll switch over to you. Just Councilman Cashman, we gave an opportunity to just introduce himself, so we'll give you the same opportunity as well if you are connected to audio now.
Thank you. I had to drop off and rejoin to do that. Thank you. And I was here at the beginning, and I did hear Councilman Cashman's remarks, and I'm here for the same reason, just as an observer. And thank you for the briefing that we all had with you and Abe Barge the other day. So you know already what our concerns are, and I'm happy to see them being addressed to some extent. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so while Josh, will you share the presentation?
Oh, and I think we need to, Sinead, on your end, can you allow the screen share?
Yeah, I'm stuck for a second here.
Okay.
Yeah, you should be all set.
See if
Okay.
that works, Josh.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Perfect.
Launching in.
All right, great.
All
And
right.
so, of course, in addition to Josh, the staff here got Libby Kaiser and Elisa Childress, and we're going to hear a little bit from Elisa more towards the end of the meeting. But go on to the next slide, Josh. Ryan kind of set things up, but I think like we want to make sure that we focus on input and questions regarding some modified strategies we're going to share with you for the suburban neighborhood context and for the urban edge neighborhood context, at least for lots that don't have alleys, in light of the discussions that we've been having since September. There are some other things that, time permitting, we can talk about, including some of the things that Councilman Cashman brought up, but we really want to make sure to get through these key things first. So go on to the next slide, Josh. Just the scope reminder for everyone that you're probably pretty tired of at this point, that what this project is about is removing barriers to ADU construction and making sure they fit into different types of neighborhoods and block patterns, like suburban lots without alleys, which will be a focus of discussion today, that we are heading towards proposed revisions to the Denver zoning code for the rules that the zoning code sets for ADUs to get to those goals, and that this particular project will not specifically propose to rezone properties that don't allow ADUs now, that would still be a separate process or separate city council initiatives in the future. We just want to get the basic set of tools right. So go on, Josh. And just a little bit of kind of a big picture, just some of the things that we've been thinking about since we met last, all the way back in early September. One of the things is just like, as we have these conversations, thinking about how, we typically will show like three-dimensional models that kind of maximize things. Like when we're talking about setbacks, we build things right to the minimum. And we're talking about height limits, we build things right to the tallest possible height limit that we could be talking about. And that, you know, sometimes that can make it feel like the buildings that we're talking about are always going to be big, or always going to be, you know, just as close as they possibly can be. And, you know, so we want to just kind of remind everyone like that's what we're typically doing, just to kind of be, you know, fairly comparing things, is that we're kind of maxing things out, but that there's other possibilities, and that, you know, in real life, that particularly with ADUs, what we've seen is that they don't typically push every limit at the same time. And you see some smaller one-story ADUs here, and we're going to show you more photos that are like that as we go through the process. Well, we're still going to like show you some models that max things out too, so just so that everybody can understand that. We've continued to hear concerns about removing the owner occupancy requirement for ADUs in single unit zone districts. That's not going to be the focus of today's conversation, but just want to let you know, and the council members know too, that, you know, we know we need to work some things out with that. So we're going to be continuing to work on that. And that we've been hearing about just concerns about fire access to the rear of lots without alleys, which we're also not specifically planning on focusing on today, but just acknowledging that we're hearing that. So, and then, you know, Councilman Cashman also brought up short-term rentals, and I know for some committee members, that's something that they want to talk about more, you know, and I know that like at a relatively early committee meeting, we kind of decided as a group, like we were going to kind of table that or not have so much discussion about short-term rentals specifically, but it is still out there, and want to acknowledge that, but not the focus of the meeting today. So the focus of the meeting today then is just getting around to that, the real pressing concerns about location and the form and height of ADUs, really in suburban neighborhoods and urban edge neighborhoods without alleys. Go on, Josh. So at the advisory committee meeting back in September, you know, we heard like, yes, great that there's a focus on context sensitivity, and you know, but that while we've done, you know, like there's so much of the conversation has been focused on the removing barrier side of that objective for the project, we do need to look at context more closely. And that means looking at those concerns about suburban ADU placement and setbacks not being sufficient enough to address the concerns, and similar concerns in urban edge neighborhoods without alleys, as well as potentially other lots without alleys. So we've thought, you know, really like the reason that we didn't have a committee meeting in October was to help give us some time to have those additional conversations about how to revise the approach to address those concerns. And so we've been having those conversations. We'll tell you a little bit more about it, but also just thought, like, since Councilwoman Black will have to leave us, that if you, Councilwoman Black, now want to jump in and just say, you know, anything about how important you think it was to have the conversations that we've been having and you've been involved with over the last month plus.
Sure, thanks, Abe. Again, I'm participating on my iPhone, so I can't see everyone who's there. So hello, everyone, whoever you are. But I represent far southeast Denver, which, you know, borders Aurora, Greenwood Village, Cherry Hills Village, and Inglewood, and it's a very suburban district. It was planned that way, and it was built that way. We have other council members that also represent suburban districts, and we all share some of the same concerns on behalf of our constituents who, as you all know, we were elected to represent. But I first wanted to point out that there aren't very many lots in the suburban zone district that are even eligible to have ADUs. And I know it is the goal of Blueprint Denver and for most council members to someday, you know, make that citywide, that ADUs could be built across the city. But in order to do that, we need to come up with some kind of building form that council members can feel comfortable with before we do that. So I know, as I said a minute ago, council members do support ADUs. You know, we all voted on Blueprint Denver, but many of you may not know that I think it was at the beginning of this year. Time's been a blur lately, but the council unanimously voted down an ADU rezoning with a waiver in my district for a couple of different reasons. Some council members aren't supportive of waivers, and other council members said we're not voting for any suburban ADUs until we figure out the building form. And that's one of the reasons we're having this work group, is because of what happened. So anyway, I just wanted to give that context. I want to thank CPD for continuing to have these conversations with me and other council members so that we can address the concerns that we're hearing about, but also remove obstacles to building ADU. So I think that's all I wanted to say. So thank you, Abe and Josh, for being so open and listening to our concerns and for working with us for some creative solutions.
Awesome. And thank you, Councilwoman. It's been very helpful. I think we've had great conversations. So if you go on to the next slide, Josh, really already kind of talked about the concerns that have been coming up, and they were reiterated in the suburban focus group discussion that we had earlier in October, which was kind of a continuation of one that we'd had in June. And, you know, it's similar concerns about ADU placement, being too close to neighbors in some cases, and how that relates to potential shadows and privacy impacts on neighboring properties. The concern about height in general, and even, you know, when we've talked about one-story ADUs that could be 17 feet tall, the same as a detached garage, you know, even concern about that being too tall. So those are some things that came up. And go on to the next slide, Josh. And we had another focus group that, you know, we were kind of trying to figure out what to call it. We've sort of been calling it Urban Edge, but really we've just been trying to make space for conversation for like residents who are concerned about the impact of ADUs and don't live in suburban neighborhoods. And really, like, the conversation was pretty focused though on the urban edge neighborhoods that don't have alleys, and how it might be appropriate really to be thinking about it as being kind of somewhere in between urban and suburban in terms of what's appropriate. Josh is going to go through this. I think that, you know, we had some good discussion about whether 2 stories could be appropriate in urban edge, and, you know, or whether we really needed the 1.5 story limitation that we'd kind of proposed to retire previously. And so I think we have some good resolution there, and then some good ideas to move forward with the concerns that come up when there's not an alley. Go on, Josh. And so overall, like, I think like the upshot of the conversations that we've been having are, we think it does make sense for the package of things that moves forward to be a little bit more nuanced about the context and use this system that we already have in place. It has the different neighborhood context to really address these different kinds of concerns that we're hearing. And what that means, like in the big picture, is that we think that most of what we've been talking about is still appropriate for urban neighborhoods, but that in suburban neighborhoods, there's some things we think we should do to address the concerns we've been hearing and be more sensitive, and then urban edge being kind of in the middle, a blend of the two. So that's what we're going to focus the discussion on. Go on, Josh. And actually, I think maybe Josh and Ryan can remind me, were we thinking we'd stop for discussion here before, but next Josh would like actually describe what we think we should do in the suburban neighborhood context and then in urban
Yeah.
edge specifically.
Yep, I think so. I think it'd be great to
Awesome.
just pause for a minute and see if anyone has any big picture questions. I will say that I think what you're describing, Josh, is sort of, I mean, Abe, is sort of the new, what people are going to hear more about and have a chance to respond to and ask questions about. So this isn't like a done deal. It's more just a more nuanced set of considerations for you all to chime in on, which is the purpose of this meeting. So any big picture questions or concerns or thoughts at this point before hearing a little bit more detail? Gabe, I see your hands up. Go ahead. You're on mute, but it looks like you're trying to get off mute. There you go.
So I know in the urban area, there's some lots and blocks that don't have alleys. So does this kind of apply to them too? A kind of a mix to be sensitive about that?
Yeah, I think we can consider those. We're still trying to pull the counts citywide to see how many actual urban lots this would apply to. We've done a good job of finding out in urban edge, but yeah, I think if that's a concern, if that's what we think, it gets dependent on, lot depth and lot width and things like that. So we're looking at striking that balance between removing barriers, but also, creating the allowance and making sure an ADU is feasible, but also sensitive to that. And so, yeah, I think we're interested in looking at those urban lots as well, if there's interest there.
And then also these are strictly for detached, right? Because the attached or the internal wouldn't really apply.
Correct. Yeah, you've got it. Detached building form is what we're mostly focusing on. That's where we've heard the concerns were arising.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great clarification, Gabe. And also maybe hold on to the thought about the urban lots without alleys, because I think what we're going to present is like, we think, we have something that we think we should do for urban edge lots without alleys. And then maybe after, kind of talking about how well that works or not, ask the question like, well, should that same approach apply in urban without alleys or not, basically?
Yeah, we're looking for that strategy of what seems to be appropriate in all those scenarios. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabe. Are there any other big picture questions right now before we get into a little more detail, hear from Josh and a few more slides, and then open it up for questions and comments? Okay. I'm not seeing any, so yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Abe, for that great overview. It's a good way to tee up the discussion for tonight. And so we want to start talking about the urban context, since we know we've just got a short amount of time with Councilwoman Black here, but looking at that initial draft strategy. So quickly looking at kind of what we presented at our last committee meeting, we talked about these core concepts of removing minimum lot sizes to at least, allow eligibility on properties to have a detached ADU. We're looking at ways to also make a single story ADU just easier to build through a lot of those form standards that we presented. As Councilwoman Black mentioned, we do need to add some of those zone districts that don't currently exist in suburban context. And we started off by looking at, lowering that height limit and what it should be based on that discussion from the advisory committee. We heard that the one story as presented or proposed then needs to be modified for maybe a little bit more setback. There were still concerns as Abe covered in his overview. And we also heard that potentially 2 stories could be appropriate, but only where a current 2.5-story building could be built today. And so the idea that if you can build a primary there, you should be able to potentially build an ADU there as well. So we looked really closely at what that meant. We had the focus group discussion, and staff and I have been feverishly looking for examples and looking about what's been built elsewhere. We've been looking at examples of suburban contexts in other cities, since we don't have the zoning district on the books here in Denver. It's hard for us to find good examples, but here's just some examples from other cities that we've seen, what people are actually building as a single story ADU. Here's a few examples that match some of the contexts. It looks a little bit urban edge potentially, some of them in suburban. But it's this idea that, you know, we assume that the people are going to build something that's looming over the neighbor's yard or has windows facing directly into their backyard. And for the most part, you know, people try to be respectful of each other's privacy and, you know, be a good neighbor. We, of course, need to still write rules in order to make sure that does happen. But here's just some quick looks at what has been built and what kind of single story ADUs do exist. So we quickly looked at, you know, what could be built today. There's only one zone district that allows an ADU in the suburban context. That's the SSUF1 allowance, which applies only to that one F lot size, which is a particularly shaped deep lot. But this is the ADU we have on the books today. It is allowed to be 1.5 stories tall, 24 feet in height, with 5-foot rear and side setbacks. We've heard pretty clearly that, you know, that doesn't feel appropriate in the rest of the suburban contexts. This shouldn't be applied to other districts. You know, we shouldn't look at this idea of just waving it into other contexts. And so, you know, what we initially had presented and talked about, the strategy at the last committee meeting, was this idea that only allowing a 1-story tall ADU, 17 feet in height, which is equivalent to the garage height and allowance today, but with a 7-foot rear setback and keeping that 5-foot setback that was part of the previously adopted zone district. We heard that, you know, that might not be enough. So we, of course, have done a lot of testing and modeling and looking at many different lot sizes and comparisons of what could be built here as a primary, as a garage, moving setbacks to and fro. And we sort of presented a couple of ideas to that focus group, and based on that feedback and input, we've heard that something more akin to this example could be appropriate. So the modified strategy that we have today is this same 1-story allowance, 17 feet tall, but with a larger rear setback, looking at something like a 10-foot setback at a rear, and then using side setbacks that would actually match the primary structure. So the primary building form is allowed to have variable setbacks depending on the lot width, up to 10 feet on our widest lots. And so we thought it was fair to look at having an ADU allowance that matched that. The 10-foot rear setback would ensure that, you know, there would be, if someone was to build an ADU adjacent to that property, the direct neighbor in the rear, it would allow for a minimum of, you know, 20 feet of spacing between those two units. Thinking about this idea of privacy and spacing, our current typical alley width citywide is about 16 feet. And so something equivalent to that distance. The other idea that we were discussing was this idea of, if 2 stories is allowed, when would it be allowed? And the idea that the strategy could be that it could be allowed only if it fits within the primary building form envelope. So in the model here, you can see the dashed line is the primary form setback allowances. So anything that you could build within that dashed line on the property could be a primary structure, could be 2.5 stories tall, up to 35 feet within that. And so we were asking the question if an ADU could fit that need too, as a detached. We do know that, you know, some folks do tend to start to maximize their envelope in a way. We do see newer suburban structures that are replacing existing smaller structures, pushing really close to that 30-foot height limit, 35 feet as a maximum. It does have a 20-foot rear setback and 7.5-foot side setbacks, which an ADU would have to match and fit in, but there's just a couple of suburban examples. And so, yeah, we were really asking the question, if you were to not build this, you know, larger primary structure, could you just add an ADU that fit within that similar envelope and potentially have, you know, less impacts as a large primary structure? And so the result came into something like this. We sort of came to the conclusion that it felt fairly appropriate that a detached ADU could be allowed if it were to fit fully within that envelope. It would still be limited to the ADU maximum height of 24 feet tall, but a full 2 stories. It would have to fit into that rear 20-foot setback, and it would also have to match the primary structure's setbacks, side setbacks, if it were 10 feet, whatever it might be. We do think this, would be more of a rare example, as it's still limited by all of those site constraints, but it's also a more costly outcome. It seems like, the more practical thing to do is to build a single story ADU in this context when you don't have to add parking underneath it. And so we think it's a, more of a rare chance that it would be built, but it would still be nice to have that potential flexibility on the properties that do have the space for it and could accommodate such a structure. Here's just a quick example of what that would look like. So here's the currently allowed 2-story primary structure. If it were to be built at the rear of the lot, at 2.5 stories at 20 feet from the lot line. And then a quick look at if it were an ADU instead, if you had a smaller ranch in the front of the house and your need for adding housing was, made more sense to do a detached ADU structure. You can see that it would be required to be smaller in height, and it is limited to its ADU use square footage of 1,000 square feet max. So we'd love to open it up to the committee and hear your thoughts on where our current strategy is headed.
So I think, first of all, if people have, that was a lot of information and it was a lot of detail, and some of you live and breathe all of this, but some don't. And so I think if folks have questions or want any of that to be sort of repeated or broken down a little bit more, want to go back to some of the visuals, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. You can even just put it in the chat to me. So does anyone have any questions, first of all, about what you just heard? Ozzy, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
So it sounds like for the 2-story scenario, would it be required for the ADU to be entirely inside the rear setback to make any use of that? I mean, like, you couldn't build a 1-story in the rear and then bump up to 2 stories when you cross the line. Would you phrase it that way?
Yeah, that was one option that we thought about. It would be the idea of like a rear bulk plane being applied. It's an interesting concept, and I think it's one that's worth potentially exploring. If the ground floor were to be able to meet the ground floor requirements, but then the upper story having to meet the 2-story requirements, it might be. It's an interesting one for us to consider, I think.
Does anyone have any comments or questions about that idea in particular? Just while we're on it.
Just hard to imagine when you're talking a max of 1,000 square feet, how that would end up playing out, but I'll let you guys do the modeling.
That's partly why we did keep it pretty simple. And it's like, if it's 1 story, it has this set of setbacks. If it's 2 stories, it has a different set of ones, as opposed to the more nuanced approach that Ozzy is talking about, which we could pursue.
And Josh, there's a question from Chelsea. Can you clarify the requirement a bit? And does it have to be in the rear setback, or has it, or it has a 20-foot rear setback? Do you see that question? Can you respond to it? And Chelsea, feel free to chime in here if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I guess on this one, so you're saying if it's 2 stories, it has a 20-foot rear setback, or you're saying it has to go in the rear setback?
No, it has to meet the 20-foot rear setback
Okay.
requirement as if it was a primary structure.
Okay, there was a comment earlier that made that a little bit confusing. So if it's 2 stories, it has to have the 20-foot rear setback.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, essentially what we're saying is, you can add an ADU within the same setbacks as you can a primary structure today. And so.
Yeah, I guess my initial comment would be just that it's interesting that, in the suburban areas, there's I mean, I live in Virginia Village and we have recently had many single-story homes get knocked down and have these massive homes that are 2 stories get built. And I mean, I understand the concerns with things being too close to the edge and things like that, but I just wonder a couple of things, like, is this actually possible in that many locations to have a 2-story? Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, have you guys done much sort of research or like looking at sort of the average lot coverage in the suburban areas, and you know, how in ADU, whether it's a single story ADU or a 2-story ADU, how that would fit in? Yeah, I guess I just have concerns in general that, like, this wouldn't work in very many locations. And then if there's too many requirements for a single story ADU, and then that also won't work in very many locations. I mean, I understand the concerns in the suburban area, but, you know, with the drastic affordable housing issue that we have in Denver and throughout the country, like, I feel like we have to push these things to make sure that ADUs are able to be built as much as we can.
Yeah. And Josh, I see a couple other hands up, but why don't you go ahead and respond and then we'll just keep going.
Yeah, all great thoughts. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have been looking at as many lots as we can and testing. Yeah, 20 feet is a big setback, but, you know, we've heard that the privacy concerns around suburban contexts are, you know, so looming that it would take something like that for folks to feel comfortable seeing one next door. The lot coverage is very high in suburban. It's 50% of your lot. And so really the lot coverage isn't the issue. It's more the setback and how deep or shallow your backyard is. And so that's why, you know, we think practically, having looked at, you know, large swaths of the city, the 1-story ADU is the more practical, you know, arrangement that I think we'll see get built in this context. But yeah.
And then I guess the other thing, I know Renee and I have talked about this separately, but the 17-foot tall requirement definitely makes things difficult when you hit, when you're discussing base plane and that type of thing. So I guess I was just wondering if that, I mean, I know like my yard, for example, we have a pretty big drop off at the rear. And so I think that 17-foot tall requirement would be difficult in many instances as well.
Good to know.
One, I'll just chime into like that, you know, some of the discussion about what maybe should be different in suburban neighborhoods was the idea that maybe it should just be attached ADUs, basically. And so, but I think there's a recognition that it's like, yes, to Chelsea's point, like, let's preserve as much flexibility as we can. And so we tried to kind of find a compromise that would allow detached ADUs to begin with, allow 2-story detached ADUs even when, you know, they would be having a similar impact to just having an attached ADU in an addition, for example. But yeah, share your concerns about like every additional setback, et cetera, does further limit the number of realistic possibilities there might be out there. So we are going to be looking at, you know, especially with 1-story ADUs, like at different lot conditions in suburban neighborhoods to see if, you know, we're potentially just, how many lots might just be really difficult for adding an ADU with a 10-foot setback for 1-story, for example.
Thanks, Abe. So Naomi's hand is up, so maybe Naomi, we go to you next, and then there's a note from Gosha in the chat as well. Go ahead, Naomi.
Thanks so much. I partly had some of the questions that Gosha and Renee were chatting about with required setbacks between structures. But I was also wondering, or maybe just a clarification, because sometimes we're talking about, should we allow 2-story buildings? Currently, they're not at all allowed in suburban context. Are we talking about that? So let me rephrase this. the second option, option number 2 of fitting the detached ADU in the building envelope, is that rather than saying if it's 2 stories, are we saying if it's over 1 story? Because I guess since we've had some nuance about like what is a full 2-story versus like what is 1.5 stories, just wanted to clarify that.
Sure, yeah, I think it's the idea that if it's going beyond this 17 feet height limit, then yeah, it falls into a, beyond a 1-story structure. And
Okay.
what we've heard was that it's the, this idea of shadows and looming and the privacy issues that are associated with more height in this context.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, but good point, Naomi, about the like 1.5 story thing that we had so much discussion about. Like, I think as Josh is going to explain when we get to Urban Edge, like we think, a lot of folks really agree that that particular limit is not making sense. And so like, it probably doesn't make sense in the suburban neighborhoods either, where you'd be allowed to build more than 1 story. There wouldn't specifically be a 0.5 story thing attached to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the other question we would have is practically, is there a need for 2-story ADUs? I mean, how many people would want to build one in this context anyway?
Yeah, that was sort of my other question of A, how often do we see it? And B, I think the benefit of having, more land in a suburban context is you can build 1-story ADUs. They're vastly cheaper, especially if we accomplish some of these other things. And a lot of the 2-story ADUs, or the 1.5 as we see currently, are accommodating garage space on the ground floor. And just the fact that, urban lots, et cetera, are smaller, so it's more efficient to go up. So yeah, I would totally agree. I don't think there's many examples, and I'm trying to think of, contexts where it would make sense for a property owner, like why they would choose to do a over 1-story ADU. So it's probably a little more rare, but I personally agree a lot with the approach of, whatever we're allowing a single unit home to be built in that envelope. We're obviously, okay regulation wise with that type of bulk and structure. And so I don't think that we should be penalizing whether it's a single unit structure or whether we've got this separate detached secondary structure if it's the same kind of bulk and massing. So thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Rosemary, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
One of the questions I have, and this came up in the Urban Edge focus group when we were looking at the modeling, it seemed that the most important thing from the neighbor's point of view was the setback was more important than the height. So in looking at these models, everything is considering the person in back. Nothing is considering the person next door. So with all these, with the suburban and with the Urban Edge, it seems like if we could somehow incentivize the ADU being placed in the center of the lot instead of off to one side, because that will have more impact on the neighbor next door.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, so we do have the bulk plane that applies, and that the idea of the bulk plane is that it helps to push that form to the center of the lot. Right, it's a good idea. I mean, of course, the wider the lot, the more room there is to move that to and from. But yeah, so we did move the side setbacks from, previously we had them at 5 feet to start. And so we're looking at matching that primary structure side setback, which could be up to, double, could be 10 feet in many cases. But I think it's following that same logic that if you can build it as a primary today, it seems, fair to be able to say that it could be a detached ADU as well. And so the privacy impacts are exactly what is allowed today as a primary. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Kind of. I mean, in the backyard, it's different than the primary structure in front. So when you're in the backyard of the house next door, and there's a 2-story structure, even considering the bulk plane, at the minimum setback, instead of farther out into the neighbor's yard, that makes a difference to the neighbor who lives next door. I mean, those models, Josh, that you showed in the Urban Edge really clarified that from the ground level. Does that make sense?
The ones Rosemary, you're talking about the models he showed in the focus group, which we're going to be showing in a minute here to the whole committee when we talk about urban edge. Okay.
Yeah. So the standards are different in suburban. Suburban, there's not a height change at the rear of the lot. So once you get 20 feet away, you're able to go up at 2.5 stories up to 30 feet. The only thing that's restricting you is the bulk plane. And so the ADU would have to adhere exactly to those, same rules. But yeah, in urban edge, it is a little different.
And I wonder when we look at those models, we might have that conversation then too. There are also a couple of notes in the chat, and I see Councilwoman Black's hands up. So let's go to you, Councilwoman Black, and then we'll go to a couple of notes in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Rosemary, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying about the side setback. And I do think it's very different in suburban than it is in urban edge, because suburban lots are generally wider and less deep. And so the side setback, I don't think it's as important that it has to be in the middle of the lot, because the suburban lot is wide and shallow. And so with the setbacks that we're talking about, I still think that is okay. If that makes sense.
It does.
Wonderful, thank you. And we can also compare when we get to urban edge. Chelsea had a quick question, Josh. Oh, never mind, you clarified in the chat. Any other comments or questions on the suburban context, form, height, anything else?
Well, I just had one other thing on the ADU versus the garage. So the main reason that you're proposing that the ADU has a larger setback than a garage is just because of the location of windows? Or?
Yeah, that's right. That's what we've heard, that,
Yeah.
people aren't living in a garage today. Well, they might be, but.
Yeah. So I
Legally.
guess, could there be some study or something done on the location of those windows and how that affects the surrounding site? I mean, I guess as someone in affordable housing, I have a really hard time with making it easier to build a garage and house a car than to build a house to house a person. And so I guess I just would like to push that a little bit more. What can we do to not incentivize a garage, basically? I mean, we're making it easier to build a garage than it is to build an ADU, and that's sort of backwards.
Chelsea, when you mentioned the question about could this city do a study or something to that effect, and are you thinking about, just to clarify, a study regarding the impacts on neighbors from having actually windows as opposed to a home with windows as opposed to a garage, and how people feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing that I find, maybe I haven't seen the numbers or, how many comments people are making in these suburban areas, but I guess the area where I live, where there's a lot of pretty young people, I mean, people around here are interested in building ADUs, and having all these requirements, making it way more difficult to build an ADU than a garage is just, I mean, it's just crazy when we're looking at the situation with affordable housing and housing in general in the Denver region. And so, yeah, I'm thinking is there some way that we can say, okay, if you have an ADU and something like this that shows, all the different options, okay, if you have an ADU, you can have it 5 feet from the rear setback, or 5 feet from the rear property line if there's no windows on that wall. If you can design your ADU so that your egress windows and all of that are facing the front and the interior side lot line, then you can push it to the edge just like you can a garage. I mean, that's just just a thought off the top of my head, but it's just when you look at these, it's this is the perfect example, right? It's why can't we push any of these really to the back if all of your egress windows work on the front and on the side. And I guess I just wonder, like, we are building houses for cars and we're not building houses for people. And I think that the people in affordable housing and the people who are affordable housing adjacent, like, we constantly have that, you know, conversation and argument with jurisdictions and people and all sorts of things. But I think that in the long run, the way to slowly make a tiny chip in the housing situation is to make it easier to build ADUs and easier to build things that will affect the housing numbers.
Thank you. There's a question from Councilman Flynn and Josh, I think city staff, maybe this is for you, but the question of, you know, is it actually more difficult to build an ADU than a garage when in this conversation we're talking about placement on the lot? Do you want to speak to that in terms of what Chelsea was referring to? And these are conversations that have happened in the committee before now too.
I might want to maybe just, since Councilman Black probably needs to leave any minute now, you still have your hand up, right, Councilman? Did you want to jump in?
If you don't mind, I do have to go, and I just wanted to respond to Chelsea. So Chelsea, thank you for those comments, and I do agree with you that we need to make it easier to build ADUs across the city. And as I was explaining to other people when we were having a meeting, is we've got to sort of get our foot in the door a little bit to get the support of our suburban constituents. And so I think that's sort of why this more moderate approach. I will say in suburban districts, although there are examples of detached garages, they are very rare. Josh showed us some pictures of some in the University Hills neighborhood where they have torn down some houses and put some up, but I could show you 9,000 suburban houses in my district that do not have an attached garage. So I don't think it's really accurate to say that we're making it easier to build a garage, because it just really doesn't happen very often. I look at it the opposite way, that we're trying to find a way to make it easier to build an ADU. And it is a little bit about the windows, but it's also about having space for to plant landscaping between a fence and an ADU. And you can't do that if it's right up against a fence, or even if it's 5 feet from a fence. So again, I'm comfortable with the setbacks that we're talking about. And I'm sorry I have to leave, but look forward to talking about this more.
Thank you so much, Councilman Black. And we maybe can get back to the question. And you know, and I would echo Councilman Black just overall that, like, while I think this conversation about like garages versus ADUs and housing versus cars is like very appropriate, and you know, we've had some great conversations about that in our past meetings. We also are just recognizing that right now, really in suburban neighborhoods, ADUs are not allowed at all in this project, because we know won't specifically change that, but we're really trying to set the stage for those allowances to begin to happen. And like, as Councilman Black said, to put our foot in the door. So we're really figuring out like what set of tools is actually going to work to create a package that could be adopted that really starts to unlock more parts of the city for ADUs. Oh, and just one thing on the windows. I think, yeah, as Councilman Black said, like we've been thinking about that as staff as well. Like, couldn't the ADUs be much closer to the rear or to the sides if they just didn't have windows, or we did something about the window placement? And our thoughts are that could probably help. And Josh also makes the point that the building code is even going to make it difficult to build windows when you're getting really close to your neighbors. But we really have heard like you know, there's just a real sensitivity about putting new dwelling units and the things that come with it so close to neighbors in suburban neighborhoods, and really the desire to just make a little bit more space when we're dealing with bigger lots, for landscaping and other things, which is kind of why we just went with the simpler solution of let's just look at the setbacks primarily.
Okay. Well, I think we are going to move here to Urban Edge because we want to allow enough time for that. But are there any final points or comments regarding the suburban piece? Just looking here. I think someone also had mentioned the fact that, as we've talked about, these concerns, some are privacy, some have to do with solar and light access, some have to do with shadowing. I see Councilman Flynn and Councilman Cashman, you both have your hands up before we move to Urban Edge. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, because Kendra went before me, but she actually articulated what I was going to say about the issue of the setbacks for the garage versus the ADU, and suburban context is different than urban context, and so there need to be different standards, and I think it's appropriate. But Councilwoman Black actually said what I wanted to say. I just wanted to close that loop. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Councilman Cashman, please go ahead. Except you're muted. Sorry, we want to make sure we catch it.
Yeah, no, it was brilliant stuff that you missed too. It's a heartbreak. No, I was just echoing what Abe said. Rather than trying to make it difficult to build ADUs, we're trying to open up an entire section of the city that has natural resistance. And so if we have to sacrifice a little bit, I think getting the buy-in is critically important. And I'm excited to welcome ADUs to suburban context.
Thank you both. Okay, fabulous. Any other final questions or comments on the suburban context before we move to Urban Edge? Okay, great. Josh, I think we're going back to you.
All good thoughts. Yeah, thanks for the robust discussion. Now, quickly looking at Urban Edge context, and what we've previously discussed there is our draft strategy from our last committee meeting. Similar to suburban, citywide, we're looking at removing that minimum lot size requirement. We know that's going to open up lots of opportunities for properties that don't have the ability to do a detached ADU today, at least make them eligible for one. We did propose the idea of allowing for a full 2 stories, but we've heard quite clearly that, maybe 2 stories isn't appropriate in all situations, especially whenever a 1 story, when an alley is not present. So 2 stories felt more appropriate when there was an alley, something similar to our urban context. It feels a bit more urban, but then in those urban edge places that don't actually have alleys, maybe a 1 story version felt a little bit more appropriate. We're also looking at adding some of that flexibility for small and narrow lots, similar to our urban context on our smallest lots in the city, which need a little bit more help, a little more flexibility to allow ADUs to be feasible. And of course, we're constantly looking at ways to make the single story ADU easier to build, the cheaper, more affordable housing solution. So yeah, we went over this with the focus group that Rosemary attended, and we got to talk a lot about this idea of the 1.5 story limitation. And lots of folks don't really get what it means in the end, but it's this idea that it's 2 stories, but the second floor can only be 75% of the lower floor. So essentially it's missing 25% of a chunk of a building here up above. And so we really honed in on that question of, if 1 story is appropriate in suburban and 2 stories appropriate in urban, would just 1.5 stories be okay to be the outcome in Urban Edge? But we looked really closely at that in practice, like what are people actually building because of this limitation, because of this rule? And so we've heard that we often get, larger ground floors than people really want to build. In order to get the square footage that you need above, you need to build, 125% of that, whatever it might be. To get 75% of what you want above, you need to build a bigger ground floor in a lot of ways. it does create, a little bit more in cost implications on the structure. Specifically, where things are bearing, this exterior wall is essentially bearing above this garage door. And so, it'd be much simpler to just run that structure to the ground, waterproofing and detailing and all the things that go into creating a second roof, et cetera, et cetera. It's all just cost added to the structure. And then really the most important thing is this idea of, is it actually changing the privacy, the impacts, the feel on the side neighbors? The neighbor on the north side of this project is seeing a 2-story structure. The neighbor on the south side essentially here is seeing a 1.5-story structure. And are those windows further away? Does it really create, those shade and privacy impacts that we assume that they're creating? And so here we are just highlighting those concerns again. This is, what's currently being built. Would allowing for 2 stories actually increase, this idea of shade and privacy? We talked through a lot of those things. So here's a possible outcome. If we were to allow a full 2 stories, you could build something like this. You could build a smaller, footprint building, allow for 2 full floors, one above the other. 100% of the ground floor can be the second floor, which is currently not allowed today. And so we're kind of limiting ourselves by not allowing this outcome in a lot of ways, where someone might want to build that smaller footprint building. They might want to have a little bit of space, a little bit more side yard, and actually plant some trees on their own property and create, a better entry feature into this structure. And so we really asked that question quite a few times with the committee, asked them, what would this be allowed? What should be allowed? So the updated proposal is looking at when alleys are present, allowing for 2 full stories, allowing for that extra 25% of building form to exist, for people to get that back in square footage, potentially a more affordable structure in the end, simplifying construction, allowing more usable square footage. But so then, considering this idea of urban edge places without alleys, we really need to look at what it means here. Should we follow the same concept as suburban? We think it needs a little bit more flexibility in this context. The lots are a tad smaller. Suburban has our biggest lot sizes citywide, 10 and 12,000 square feet in some places. Whereas in this context, we're seeing, smaller 5, 7, 8,000 square foot lots. These lots tend to be a little bit shallower than, that suburban context. And so the primary structure, the main house, appears to be placed a little bit more center of the lot. And so you do have sort of those larger front setbacks like a suburban context, but you're also getting a bit of a smaller backyard in a lot of ways. And so the other big thing is the building coverage allowance is less than in suburban. Suburban, you're allowed to cover 50% of your lot with buildings. In urban edge, you're only allowed to cover 37.5%. And so taking those things into consideration, we think that, this context does need a little bit more flexibility for this detached outcome when alleys are not present specifically. We looked pretty closely at where these exist. And so we have about 11,000 parcels citywide in this context that are not on an alley, which is about 1/3 of all of our urban edge context properties, single unit properties, that is. And so, 1/3 of these places, 1/3 of these properties fall into this scenario. So we do think it's important to come up with a workable solution. So currently the allowance is this. Today we do have this zoning on the books, ESU D1, which allows an ADU of 1.5 stories, 24 feet tall. And the setbacks are currently set at 5 foot rear and 5 foot side, regardless of alley or no alley. There's no distinction in the code today for these type of scenarios. And so we've heard, we should look more closely at this specific situation. So we've come up with a sort of modified proposal of what we've heard the committee talk about feels more appropriate. So when there is an alley, the urban edge context would follow something more closely to the urban allowance. And then when there isn't an alley, it would be something more closely related to the suburban context allowance, but potentially modified with a bit more flexibility due to some of those lot constraints. So the proposal for a single story allowance would be, or without an alley, if you build it as a single story, it would be 17 feet with a 5-foot rear setback. But looking at, once again, matching that primary side setback, as before it was 5 feet. And so thinking of this idea that Rosemary brought up about your side neighbors also having concerns, it would be a bit deeper. The side setback, similar to suburban, follows that lot width configuration. And so up to 10 feet on our widest lots, 7.5 feet for other lots, potentially down to 5 on some of our smallest lots. Here's an example of what that would look like as well. So if it's a single story structure, similar to a garage, 17 feet tall with a 5-foot rear setback, which is the garage rear setback in this context. And then looking at also matching that primary side setback to kind of accommodate for side neighbors. And so the last question we had is when 2 stories would potentially be appropriate here, if a 2-story is appropriate in suburban within the existing building form envelope. Could there be some flexibility in this context to where the ADU could actually exceed that primary form envelope a little bit, as we know a little bit more flexibility might be warranted. And so we're looking at something like this, a 2-story allowance being that 24-foot tall structure, but something closer to maybe a 12-foot rear setback away from the property. That would give you, quite a bit of spacing between 2 structures, 24 feet, equivalent to almost an ADU on an alley today with a rear setback. And once again, we'd be matching that primary side setback of the structure. There's also, of course, the bulk plane and everything else associated with it, just like the primary structure. But once again, it's this question of, how popular would these be if you don't need to put parking underneath it? How many people are actually going to be interested in building the more expensive 2-story ADU in this context, when the footprint and the square footage is limited in many ways? But we do think that it feels, equitable to keep this option available for those certain scenarios and lot situations where it could be appropriate. So quickly looking at just one last view of what that might look like. 12-foot rear setback away from the ADU here at 24 feet tall from the neighboring backyard is what we think we'd like to start with. We'd love to open it up and hear your thoughts here, especially knowing what we just heard about suburban and how folks feel about those setbacks.
So Renee, Donna, Rosemary, I see your hands up. And of course, if people have questions about any of this, don't hesitate to ask those as well. But Renee, go ahead.
This is really a clarifying question for Josh, for what you're proposing. I agree. I mean, 2-story ADUs are so costly. And what we're seeing here would be, and what we're thinking of, a garage on the main floor and an ADU above. Since there's not car access, it's not technically a garage. So would someone be building then an office? And is that use allowed? Is it like an office or a workshop or a studio? And is that permitted below an ADU? Like, does the lack of car access change that allowance?
No, so the full 2 stories could be all ADU use, as long as you don't maximize your 1,000 square feet. It could be 500 feet below, 500 feet above. A
Okay,
500.
so all right. So both living spaces.
Yeah, it could be 100%
Okay.
ADU use. Yeah, but it is limited to that ADU use limitation of 1,000 square feet maximum, right?
Okay, so a new allowance altogether. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Donna, go ahead.
So I also had a clarifying question. With no alleyways, a detached ADU, would that present a problem for, I thought the first slide that one of the first slides that you displayed talked about fire truck access. So I'm sorry, I kind of just need a little clarification on that. I guess I would have thought that the ADU in that context would then have to be attached to the main
Yeah,
structure.
no, it's a good question, good clarification. So Denver fire does review every single, permitted habitable structure. They review it for fire code and egress issues. And so they have, denied projects, ADU proposals, in fact, that were, didn't have enough egress, didn't have enough clearance to where people couldn't get in and out of the structure, or that, Denver Fire couldn't access the structure. They also look at things like fire hydrant placement and hose length. And so if the structure is placed too far away from a fire hydrant, you either have to, adhere to the rules and move the structure closer, or they just deny it outright and say it's unsafe. And so detached structures are allowed, and they are, no matter what we say in zoning, Denver Fire has the final say. So we do have a set of checks and balances that, nothing unsafe would be permitted today. It has to meet modern life and safety codes. So.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. Rosemary, go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up something that we had talked about earlier, and I don't think any solution has been determined, is how to incentivize one-story ADUs instead of two-story ADUs. And in the Urban Edge focus group, it was brought up that it's really difficult to eliminate the rear setback because of the cost of construction if you have zero setback. So have you thought more about how to other ideas to incentivize one-story ADUs? Because I think clearly, what we just talked about here with the Urban Edge, without an alley, one story is preferable, and is two-story really needed? But also in Urban Edge with alleys, I think one story, if we could somehow make those more attractive for people to build, or give them a little leeway.
I can take
good
that,
question.
Josh, if you want.
And some perks.
No. Yeah, I think we're incentivizing a single story in quite a few ways by, applying that lot coverage exemption to an ADU, which only applies to garages now, which forces people to put their living of an ADU above a garage, right? So we're doing that. That's a big one, allowing up to 500 square feet of lot coverage exemption. We're also looking at, removing the building length requirement. There's a building length maximum for an ADU of 36 feet. And so if you're, you wanted to do a long, skinny, single story ADU, you can't do anything beyond 36 feet today. And the biggest incentive, I think, is going to come down to cost, really. I think some of our, affordable housing, our builders can really speak to this idea that, people can only build what they can afford. And if they look at the price of a two-story ADU and it's double the price of a single story ADU, I think there's going to be a lot of incentive there to go with that single story product.
Yeah, I think I was jumping ahead, Josh, because I think you're going to touch on this later. So I agree with all those later proposals. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think we may not, Rosemary, be getting to the talking about urban and urban edge lots with alleys at all, really, other than just to say we think we've kind of resolved the question about 1.5 stories. But but yes, since we're not getting to it later, like, you had thought like maybe you should be able to do the same thing as a garage in the rear with a one-story ADU, and I think we think that makes sense.
Yep.
Great, Councilman Cashman, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Josh, Abe, I'm kind of swimming in exceptions and setbacks. Remind me why in the urban edge context without alleys, we're going with a 5-foot setback instead of the same setback that we arrived at for suburban.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's this idea of our context-based approach, like as we move towards a more urban bit of the city, these lot sizes, shapes do change. And so we're looking for increased flexibility where, increased as you move closer to the city center, density is tending to increase as well. Demand for housing is increasing. And so we're looking for those potential solutions.
I hear that, but so at least in the picture we're looking at, it looks to me like we're looking at 125-foot deep lots. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's the primary structure placement that's going to be different here. The setbacks are
Right, so
Greater
it's
from
not,
the front.
it's not an issue of privacy or crowding, it's that we're moving closer to city center. And so you're comfortable proposing a more urbanized, dense context.
I think we're looking for flexibility where we can get it, where we need it. I think the idea that these lots are just more challenging in a way. I mean, I think, we're considering privacy in every one of these, solutions, and that's how we got to the appropriateness of a one-story structure in suburban and those considerations. And so, yeah.
Okay, not completely on board with that setback, but I understand your reasoning. Thank you.
Right, and I think that kind of relates to like what Chelsea is in the chat, just talking about, well, how, does this logic about privacy and everything else not extend across all of the context? Like, why is it different in suburban? Why is it different in urban edge? And, I mean, we're certainly seeing in the conversations that we're having that there's a pretty different perception and really different expectations. And I think, from my perspective, at least, Chelsea's right. There isn't a fundamental difference, but there is a very big difference in how people see their neighborhoods. And I think, we're just seeing that it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, do we want to honor the fact that some people want to live in a dense environment, some people don't? Or do we feel we're at a point in time where that flexibility of honoring those differences needs to go out the window?
Yeah, I think this committee is all about sort of figuring out helping think about the balance and the trade-offs and providing input to the city as you all find what those trade-offs should be, what the balance should be. Others want to chime in on this? I see a couple of notes in the chat, but so feel free to verbalize those, and otherwise they can just stay in the chat.
Yeah, a lot of good
I have a
dialogue.
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the suburban, you were proposing a side setback where the ADU had to be in the same setback as the primary home. Is that the same here in the urban edge?
Yeah, that's what we currently have as the modified strategy here. It was previously 5 feet. And so, yeah, we're looking at increasing that to match the primary, depending on lot width.
I think you need to, I would like for you to study that a little bit more, because there are areas where the primary home is very small. And I mean, I think sometimes the best place to achieve privacy and open space is going to be, not in line with a small primary home. And so there may be some unintended limitations that you create with that, and would really ask you to consider, like, that is almost based on preference and suburban context, and applied in a different context, I think is very problematic. It's too prescriptive and not form-based enough, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Renee,
just
can I ask
Yeah.
you're probably going to say the same thing I was just like making sure we clarify, like the setback being the same as the primary. We're saying the minimum setback rules would be the same for a primary and an accessory dwelling unit. If
Not
a
the
primary
setback.
happens to have a really big setback, that's way more than the minimum, you still could build the ADU closer to the side than the primary. It would just have the same
Yeah,
rules.
not matching the structure, but
That is a very good clarification. I thought you were saying matching the structure, all new rules here, but you're not.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it would match the setback requirement for the primary
Requirement.
structure. That's right.
Yeah, that's good
So, yeah,
clarification.
It's
Thank
lot
you.
size adjusted. So on the smallest lots, it's down to 3 feet and up to 10
Okay.
feet on our largest lot sizes.
Thank you
That's
so much
better.
yeah, I have a feeling others had similar questions. Thanks, Renee, for clarifying that.
Yeah, a lot more great dialogue in the chat if you want to elevate any of those conversations, I think.
maybe Naomi had was talking about a situation near her. It'd be interesting to know more about that.
Naomi, do you want to say more about the note you put in the chat about Urban Edge properties?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize kind of what Josh was saying about it's such an interesting like Urban Edge is a really interesting context. There's a bunch around me in the Skyline neighborhood. I'm there all the time. There's a couple of ADUs there too. And it is true, they are larger lots and they're this weird combination of kind of suburban and urban, and just the houses do tend to be placed a lot more central towards the lot. I think we're just in terms of talking about a 17-foot setback from the rear of the property. Again, these are all alleys, so I'm not talking about a not alley situation. Just thinking about the ADUs that I do know that exist in the Urban Edge context around me, if they were required to do a 17-foot setback, it wouldn't work. I think it would be very, very awkward for anybody to actually build one of those. So if anyone ever wants to walk around the Skyline neighborhood, it's an interesting example of Urban Edge and some ADUs. And also people, when they've built additions, tend to build back pretty far, but again, because the structures are already set back pretty far, it starts pushing things. Not to say then they couldn't maybe try an attached ADU, but it is, yeah, just wanted to validate kind of what Josh was saying with my experience in my neighborhood.
Thank you. It's
And
good
then just to clarify,
Yeah.
like I just changed the slide too. I was afraid it was unclear that I did the 17 feet number is the height that goes with 1 story, not the required setback that would be proposed. So the side setback wouldn't be any more than is required for the primary, which goes up to what in Urban Edge, Josh? It's no more than 7.5 feet at the absolute largest, I think.
Oh, got it. Sorry, I got confused there.
No
Anyway,
problem.
so
That's right.
context sensitivity to the required setback in the back.
Yeah, no, I think to Councilman Cashman's point, he was interested in matching the same setback in suburban for a 17-foot tall structure, which would be saying a 10-foot rear setback would be needed here in this context. And so, yeah, we're asking the question if is this context, different enough, unique enough to need that flexibility, need a smaller rear setback than 10 feet? That's the question we have. Whoops.
And at this point, Josh, you're asking that question, and where do you feel that you all are at as staff in answering that? Would you say at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think our current strategy is that we found that it does need more flexibility. It is different than the suburban context. I mean, obviously, privacy concerns are the same citywide. And so we're trying to balance that idea of privacy, practicality, buildability, removing barriers, but also being sensitive to the context. And so, yeah, I mean, currently our modified proposal is finding something in between the 10-foot. We're looking at in our urban places going down to 0 on an alley where garage door isn't present. And so if you find the perfect split between 0 feet and 10 feet, this context points to 5 in some ways.
Yeah, so our answer is clearly yes. Let's be more flexible than suburban. We think it's important because the lot conditions are more difficult in a lot of cases. It's smaller. Also because I think, there's a wider variety of conditions, and overall, we think a little bit less sensitivity. So let's be flexible where we can, but that we think it does make sense to acknowledge that there's more sensitivity than urban. And so that's this kind of in-between thing that you see kind of in the diagram. That's where we are, for sure.
Perfect. And I think the plan is here in a minute to have one of you, and maybe Elisa, I think you might be doing this, is to just sort of do a step back. Obviously, this is a lot of information. It's a lot of different, you know, we're talking about setbacks, we're talking about height, we're talking about stories, we're talking about rear and side, and there's a lot of information. So I think we're going to hear from you all just as sort of a wrap up, and then with a chance to sort of, you know, have some concluding thoughts, any concluding sort of messages from you all, the city, or from committee members, and then we're going to talk about next steps. So I think we're probably just about there. Are there any other comments though first, or questions, input about this Urban Edge proposed strategy? Okay, great. All right, so Elisa or whoever from the city is doing this, could you sort of, do we still have more here?
No, you're good. We'll jump to
Okay.
Elisa.
Okay.
Yes, so we have seen a lot and talked a lot just now, so I'm just going to try to put things back into the bigger picture perspective, and give you a high level overview of the form proposal strategy. So in the urban neighborhood context, we're looking at greater allowances overall. This does include a height maximum of 2 stories and 24 feet, a 5-foot rear setback, and then some more flexibility for narrower lots. In the urban edge context, we're proposing a bit of a blended strategy based on the presence of an alley. So lots with alleys would have rules that are more similar to the urban allowances, while lots without alleys would have rules more similar to the suburban allowances. And then in terms of the suburban context, we are proposing kind of tighter allowances overall. So with a 10-foot rear setback, 1 story and a 17 feet, ADU would be allowed, and then a 2-story ADU would only be allowed where a 2.5-story primary structure is also allowed. So that is the high-level overview of the form strategy. And then something we haven't talked about much today is also the use strategy. So I'm going to do a quick overview to check in back on that as well. So we're proposing a couple of different things here. First is allowing ADUs as accessory to other uses such as duplexes and row homes, which isn't currently allowed. Next would be removing the owner occupancy requirement in single unit districts, along with increasing the use allowance in square feet. And then lastly, removing the overcrowding rule that says that ADUs should have a minimum of 200 square feet of gross floor area per occupant.
Yeah. Thanks, Elisa. I think we just wanted to open it up and see if, how people feel about the general strategy that, we're taking.
And if Josh and Elisa folks have comments or want to discuss any of the things on this slide 41, that we haven't focused on tonight, maybe you all could talk about the plan for that or how those things can be considered. So Councilman Cashman, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't understand the need to remove the owner occupancy requirement. It's one of the few tools we have to limit the ability of large investment companies to buy up our housing stock, jack up the prices. It's one of the same reasons I feel strongly that we need to have an option for an ADU that doesn't allow short-term rentals. The idea is to create housing stock, not to build hotels. So I hate removing the owner occupancy requirement. It's a big mistake. Thank you.
And I think there's a couple of notes in the chat. I mean, I think Donna, you're echoing Councilman Cashman's comments. Chelsea, it might be helpful to hear this comment from you, and Rosemary, I think your hand is up too. So Rosemary, go ahead, and then Chelsea, if you want to verbalize what you put in the chat, or you could just leave it there, that's fine.
Well, I absolutely concur with Councilman Cashman. I don't really understand why this, I think it's not that common that somebody would move out, and then it just, I don't understand the motivation for removing that requirement. I'm also concerned about removing the overcrowding rule with areas like close to DU. Allowing a lot of students to, to kind of crowd into a small structure. So I don't understand why those are even being considered to be removed.
And I see some hands have gone up, and I'm trying to remember which meeting it was. It was early that we had more conversation specifically about these two issues. And, obviously there are meeting summaries about that just in terms of refreshers, but obviously it doesn't mean that the issue is done. It just means that there was some initial discussion. Emily, I see your hand up next. Go ahead.
As far as the overcrowding rule, I definitely hear you, Rosemary, when you're talking about like cramming a ton of students in the DU area. I think it's just from as far as like the East Colfax area, we have a lot of families who are unable to afford housing. And so it's really important for a lot of them who have to kind of double up. Like we have a lot of doubled up families and things of that nature, where they don't qualify or are ineligible to live when there are restrictions in place such as that, and more traditional housing as well. So I just think that one is a really helpful one for like our area, because it would allow for and I hear you on Councilman Cashman, like I hear you on that too, but it's just like it is difficult and housing is getting so expensive. And so just to remove that, I think it's helpful to, allow 1 or 2 extra people to live there for affordability sake.
And Chelsea, your comment earlier, you have 2 comments in that. I feel like I should just let you speak.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit more. I mean, I think if Renee is still here, she could also speak to this, but I mean,
She's just put a note in the chat as well.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to read it, but there are lots of different ways to require a property to be sold or to be rented to a person of a certain income level. I think that in this instance, it would definitely be an administrative add to probably host or someone at the city of Denver. So that is certainly something that would need to be looked at. But I think that, often the conversation about ADUs is about affordability and adding to the housing stock. And so I think that, I also hesitate to just like flat out remove the owner occupancy requirement, because I do think that what Councilman Cashman is saying is absolutely true, that, then there are all kinds of opportunities for investors and that type of thing to just like buy things outright. I think we've seen that all over the city. But I do think that we should try to look into what the options are to create some sort of affordability requirement, affordability covenant, or, some sort of restriction around how you could potentially not be an owner occupant in the house or the ADU if, you fulfill these X number of things, or, it would be complicated. I totally get that, but maybe Renee can add a little bit more to kind of, she's more on that side of the covenants, and I'm more on the other side of non-rental covenants. But yeah, I think there are ways to do it. It would just take some gumption.
So Renee, I don't know, you might want to chime in here, but it sounds like so far you all are talking about similar things in terms of, removing barriers to ADUs, but at the same time, not opening up to speculation in new ways, and that maybe having an affordability restriction could be some way to walk the line. Renee, did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to hear what this group thinks about that, because I mean, I understand the need for more housing, but I'm also, you know, I see both sides of it. 40% of the families that were displaced in West Denver, including south of District 3, were displaced by investors. So investors have discovered where they can make some money, and they are having a huge impact on our neighborhoods. So, you know, I think that we have to balance adding more housing and be really clear about what we're creating it for. I think that deed restrictions are useful. I think they'd be really hard to implement across the board, just like it's hard for owners sometimes. Like, this rule prevents owners from building because it's a forever investment, and they would have to decommission or take out their ADU if they had to leave. And it's very confusing for homeowners in many cases. So it's a policy that has been removed in other cities. It needs clarifications. And then I had put in the chat, I mean, Denver has no ADU incentives. That's why overall, you know, regardless, I know we have to figure out this form stuff. ADUs still are not getting built by the market because there's no incentives. And if we're going to incentivize things, we should incentivize affordability. So I would support that those comments that were made.
Thank you. Gosha, I think your hand just went up as well. And Emily, I see your hand up. I don't know if it's up from before or up again, but you can go next after Gosha.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with both Chelsea and Renee. And I think a way to look at it is could be very similar to the way the expanding housing affordability was structured, to where additional density is looked at as an incentive for affordability. So I think similarly to expanding housing affordability, we could look at ADUs that we can incentivize them or allow or lift the ownership requirement if the properties are affordable, just like we allowed additional 2-story on buildings in high density areas that provide higher affordability. So it's just kind of extension of that thinking and the same program that we already have in place.
Great. Thank you. Tara, I see, and Gabe, you all just put comments in the chat. Please raise your, feel free to verbalize any of this. Ozzy, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I wanted to speak more to the form-based work that has been done over the last month and a half for the suburban and urban edge districts. On this committee, I've mostly focused on representing Baker and the other like urban row house type districts. So I didn't try to participate in this, but seeing what happened through this process, I'm really impressed. I think that this is a very nuanced and thoughtful approach to addressing the concerns that were brought up about bringing ADUs to the suburban and urban edge zone districts. And speaking not as somebody representing, but just as an architect who likes to design ADUs, I would love to see this go forward in a form where the council people on this call today feel like their neighborhoods will want to adopt zoning that allows ADUs. The best case outcome for these new ADU zone districts would be large parts of the city wanting to adopt them and opening up all these housing opportunities that don't exist at all right now. I think you've done great work towards that. I think ultimately we want to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible, because that probably helps with getting people to understand what they'll be supporting. And yeah, I hope this works. I mean, I love doing complicated 2-story ADUs in the urban zone districts, and I would love to design sweet little 1-story ones in the back of suburban zone districts if that were a possibility.
Thanks, Ozzy, and for acknowledging the balancing act and the many interests behind that. Renee, yeah, go ahead.
I'll be quick. I just want to thank everyone for really pushing the envelope on one-story ADUs. They are most approachable. They provide family living. No one in our program has asked for a two-story ADU. So that's really the proof in the pudding there. And two quick other points. People really value their open space. So when it's tight and we're imagining that someone would cram an ADU in, it's really just not going to be the case. A lot of people are going to choose to not do an ADU, and that's good too. And then I would just say, one of the things that we really need to address is existing structures. And if there's going to be flexibility on any of these setbacks once we land on them, I know we're not there yet, to allow for existing structures to be safely converted, because that's yet another way for us to provide some housing in a way that's environmental and low cost and suited to many families' needs who are doubled up. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. And that definitely echoes conversations from earlier in former meetings about existing structures. Let's see. Any other, I think we're moving now towards wrapping up and talking about what comes next. This has been really, really great discussion. Are there any other comments, questions? Things that folks haven't yet had a chance to share or ask? Okay. So staff, can we turn it back to you all to sort of lead us through what happens next? And then we'll make sure to allow some time for anyone in the public audience that wants to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, you know, another great set of discussions today. I appreciate the dialogue. I feel like a lot of people were able to chime in and really voice their opinions today, and we appreciate that. So with that, you know, feedback that we've received today, we'll continue pushing the narrative, pushing this alternatives reports that we sent out earlier today. We're going to wrap that up and make that public. And so everyone's fully aware of all the work that, you know, staff has been doing in the coming months, looking at all the alternatives that we've addressed. Shout out to everyone on the team, on staff, for working hard in the meantime. But yeah, so we're pushing towards creating, you know, a final strategy report, which will entail all of these things and essentially have our final strategy on the books of what we think is, you know, should be brought forward to council. We'll obviously bring that to our committee meeting in December once we're ready to have that. But it'll include a lot of these details that folks have brought up today, some of the things that, you know, we can't get into in all of these meetings, like existing structures, like some of these, you know, smaller use requirements, a lot of that sort of technical detail. We'll have that out for you to review, and we'd love, you know, more feedback on that. And so we'll try to get you a draft of that prior to that meeting so we can discuss. But after that, we will have a, you know, final strategy review period for the entire public to view that document as well for at least a full month. Moving into the new year, where we'll take the feedback from that after that review period, finally start to draft our proposed zoning amendment and bring that through the adoption process. Are there any questions on process moving forward, or what is to be expected? Is there anything that's unclear about how we move towards an actual text amendment adoption?
I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, yep, go ahead. Renee, go ahead.
So I have a question. Josh, I know that it's been really clear what the scope of the work on this project is, but because it includes barriers, there are barriers that are not form-based. There are barriers in cost. There's barriers that in some ways small ADUs are treated the same as any other development, which is problematic. And in some ways, not enough, they're treated differently, which really drives up the cost of infill residential development. It incentivizes $1 million homes. It incentivizes demolitions. It incentivizes big ADUs that then need short-term rentals to pay the cost of building them. And looking at the barriers is important as the form base, because we could pass these form base and still carry on the barriers, which then drives up the cost of all these new ADUs that are allowed. So they really need to go hand in hand if we're talking about housing and more ADUs that can house more people, and not these trophy and unapproachable, nicely designed ADUs, but not really housing for the average person. Are we going to be able to do that or talk about that before we get to this? Because I do think it's important.
Definitely. Well, I mean, I guess, you know, we've talked about a lot of those things. I hope, you know, building code requirements, you know, infrastructure, tap fees, all those things, fees, permitting in general. But yeah, I mean, there are implementation, you know, phases after this project. So we do want to get the zoning regulations adopted, get this done and complete, and see the sort of impact that has. But yeah, we're interested in pushing the idea further amongst other departments and seeing where we can alleviate some of those requirements. I mean, many of them, you know, they are structural life and safety code requirements that are basically immovable at some level. Fire code requirements and things having to do with, you know, the foundation requirements, etc. We're happy to, you know, continue those dialogues, but it's tougher, I would say, to move the needle through something like that. We're looking at the zoning text amendment now being the greatest, you know, change agent at this point. I mean, we are still in dialogue with the AIA, and there's interest there for more architects to potentially do some of those like pre-approved plans and, you know, donate some of their time and effort to looking at prototypes and things like that. And so we're interested in this idea of, yeah, being able to streamline permitting and having these resources available, but that does fall, you know, after the adoption of the new rules in this project.
Yeah, so I think, like, you know, ideally, right, it's like all of these important issues would be part of one single package. Like practically what Josh is describing, you know, because of the scope of this project, we're really focused on those zoning, location, and form and use rules that we've been talking about. And that will be the focus of the strategy report, because the strategy report is going to lay out exactly what we're going to draft for a proposed zoning amendment near term. But I think, like, hopefully Josh doesn't disagree with this, but I think it would be perfectly appropriate for that strategy report to like record all of those things that really need to be part of next steps actions. And like, you'll continue to be a great resource, Renee, for making sure we've captured all those things. And I think it's great that you've been in dialogue with the city for quite some time now, and will continue to be about just like making progress on all those things moving forward. But we'll focus, like, we know we can like make this zoning proposal, so we're pretty focused on that near term.
Yeah, I do remember also at the very beginning of this process, we highlighted the fact that those things could be recorded, ideas and suggestions, and needs to help implement this in equitable ways, and those could be put in that strategy report. So
yeah, definitely, that'll all be included. And if there's something we haven't, you know, talked about or addressed, we'd love to still know what those are. So please do send them our way or share when you can.
okay, so folks should feel clear if there are things that haven't been addressed in this process as part of the sort of form-based topics that focus on form and use, that those can also go into the strategy report. And we'll have time at the final meeting in December to talk about all those things, and maybe city staff can list the ones they've heard so far, and we can have you all add. Okay, so I do want to wrap up so that we have a chance to hear from public comment, but what else? Josh, Lisa, Abe, anything? What else in terms of next steps?
That's all we have, I think. Yeah, we're going to wrap up this alternatives report and make that public, but feel free to give comments on that. I sent out a draft of that with this meeting agenda. So if you have a chance to look at it, feel free to comment on that if you have anything. We'll be producing that document and then, yeah, gearing up towards refining what we've heard tonight, but looking at this final strategy draft for our next meeting to really talk about what we think our best strategy is moving forward towards an amendment to the code.
Okay. So the next meeting is our last meeting, and that's just pulling it all together, talking about what else needs to be looked at by the city to make all this work. And so if folks have additional thoughts, feel free to follow up by email in the meantime. And I do want to open it up for a couple of minutes of public comment. I see 2 hands up. And Sinead, do you want to sort of enable people to talk? I don't know who was first there.
Yeah, let me go ahead and do that.
Thank you. Okay, so Jeff, I think you can go ahead if you want to take a minute and share your comment or question.
Yeah, just a couple comments. The thing that Renee brought up about you using existing buildings. I mean, we can do everything with the zone code, but the challenge there is going to be the building code stuff. So I just want to keep that in mind, that we might be able to change setback rules and things like that, but we're still going to have building code issues from these old buildings. So that adds another layer of challenge. So just wanted to put that in there because it won't be just a home run as soon as we get zoning stuff changed. And then the second one is I wanted to bring up that you guys have touched on a little bit is this the use allowance for the ADU in regards to on 7/1 of 2021, I guess 2021. Yeah, the text amendments went through and that removed the maximum habitable space rule that was right on the detached accessory dwelling unit chart, pretty much the chart that everybody goes to reference the code. But the use allowance was left back in that SU district where the owner occupancy thing is. And I know I've talked to Josh and Abe about it a little bit, but I just don't know if everybody understands the use allowance and the restriction and what the impacts that actually has on buildings. And what I'm hearing throughout this entire process is most people's concerns are the size and the massing of these and privacy and things like that. But nothing's ever talked about the use. The form allows you to build a giant 1,000 square foot garage with a 750 square foot ADU above it on your biggest lots. But you can only have 1,000 square feet of that all be habitable space, where the bottom or some other part would have to be non-occupied, non-habitable space, which in my opinion doesn't make any sense because we're choosing cars over people again. And if you build 1,000 square foot garage, it could be a giant workshop with chop saws, air compressors, everything running. Why do we care what's inside those doors? The building still can be subordinate to the primary structure by being smaller in size, but on a lot that's over 11,000, 12,000 square feet, has a 4,000 square foot house on it. If you could have all use, the building form's the same as the code is right now. You can build a 1,750 square foot building. You could only have 1,000 square feet of that being living. So why do we care what's behind those walls? And in reality, a garage or a giant shop with chop saws and air compressors could be more disturbing to neighbors than families. And so the code pushes us into making these buildings for 1 or 2 people, but maybe this could be a small starter home for a couple and a baby or something like that. Or maybe a downsize and the family's kids could move into the front house or something like that. So it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I know it seems like it's a political battle, but I think if you present it in the right way, like I just did, and maybe it's only on the bigger lots that you can go up to the full size or something like that. And I know you're addressing some of those issues, but I don't know what benefit this does except for get bigger garages. So I've actually put together a proposal if anybody would like to see that. I've got images and everything like that I could share. So
Thank you, Jeff. And it sounds like you are in touch with Josh and Abe, and obviously some of that speaks to many conversations that have happened in the committee, but thanks for sort of putting it the way you just did. And Joel, I want to make sure we have a chance for you as well. So I think you should be able to talk now. Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, great. I just want to take a moment to thank the committee for this great work and staff. I think I mentioned this early on at maybe your first or second meeting. What a great committee and focused staff right from the start with the issues identification so that everybody knows what problems we're trying to solve so everybody can remain focused. There's a lot of topics we could talk about. You know, we could talk about missing middle more broadly. We could talk about standard designs that are pre-approved, et cetera. All of that, if you imagine the complexity that is already being dealt with here, all of that would kind of blow the complexity of this project out of the ability to manage. So the fact that you picked a clear focus, it's multifaceted, you've addressed all the facets and even gone through, I think in the last few months, kind of the difficulties of thinking you've converged on solutions, illustrating them, showing them in 3D, getting some reactions, and then having to adjust just shows how resilient and contextual that this effort is. So kudos to everybody.
Thanks, Joel. Well, what a nice way to end our meeting. Congratulations to everyone for sort of sticking with it and being so thoughtful in your comments and questions. So I think with that, we're going to end maybe even 30 seconds early. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you for the last meeting in early December, and stay safe out there in the snow. Hope we get a lot of it.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion, everyone.
Happy 30 seconds. Stay safe.
Good night. Bye.